Hi, storyteller. If you've ever written a novel or attempted to write one, chances are high that you have tried using a formula to structure your plot. Whether it's the 3-act story structure, the 5-act, the 7-point, the hero's journey, the heroine's journey, Freytag's pyramid, Harmon's story circle, or Snyder's beat sheet, also known as the Save the Cat method. Wow. And these are just the most well-known few. Having so many novel structure formulas can seem really overwhelming, like which one should you pick? Which one works? The thing is that all these formulas work if your story fits into the structure that they're prescribing. You see, story formulas are pretty much just recipes. They give you a list of key ingredients and step-by-step guidance to produce something that you and others might want to consume. If you follow the steps to making a cheese pizza, you will likely end up with a cheese pizza, provided you've got some basic skills. And novel formulas aren't too different from that. They do get a bad rep, but just like cheese pizza, they can be pretty decent, especially if you're in the mood for one. So, in case it's not clear, I'm not vilifying formulas or saying they don't work. If you found one or two that work for you, great! The downside of formulas isn't that they're formulaic, but rather that, unlike actual cooking recipes, they unfortunately don't often tell you what type of story that they're good for, in terms of scope, genre, theme, pace, or anything else really. Like, if you want to make a cake, you're really gonna struggle with that if you're following the recipe for a pizza. Similarly, if you want to write an epic trilogy about cultural upheaval, you're really gonna struggle with that if you're trying to follow the Save the Cat method. So, if you've tried one or more formulas and they didn't really pan out for you, or they kind of worked but you'd like to understand some principles better, you've come to the right place. I will give you a tool to structure your novel without a formula. I call it plot questions. Yeah, I know, not the most brand name term, but hey, it is what it says that it is. In this video, I will explain what a plot question is and the benefits of using them, how exactly they work to build a successful plot, and 3 do's and don'ts when you're using them to structure your own novel. And perhaps it goes without saying, but this tool will only be useful to you if your story does have a plot. If you're writing a highly literary piece that doesn't rely on external events very much, or you're writing an episodic structure without a strong through line, this technique will be of less use to you. And if you are using a formula, you can still apply this principle to check if your story is flowing well. With that stated, let's dig in. Why should you use plot questions and what are they? You're probably intuitively aware that when it comes to a story, the needs of a writer and a reader are a little bit different. In effective and memorable stories, plot, and here I'm talking about the literal external events and happenings, plot serves to highlight the characters and the theme. And because of that, for many, if not most writers, the details of a plot are the last thing that really becomes finalized. You might, of course, have the broad strokes from the beginnings, but the specifics of what happens, when, and how, that tends to be worked out in the drafting and revision stages. This is flipped for readers. Readers tend to notice and focus on plot first and foremost. To go back to our analogy, when your reader is eating that piece of cake that you've baked, they are aware of the smell, taste, texture, and general pleasure that it gives them, and they're happily oblivious about flour, oven temperature, baking time, and all the other choices that you had to make to create that experience for them. Now, there are several stages in the writing process when you should not even think about your reader and just focus on your writing needs. But the overarching structure, the way that you are serving the plot, is not one of those stages. Here, you should be aware of what the reader wants, assuming you want them to actually want to read your story and be engaged by it, because plot is such a primary way readers make sense of the story. When readers talk about stories, they don't say, "Oh my god, you have to read it. It's about the importance of staying true to your principles, even if it means that you're losing power." Instead, they say, "Oh my god, you have to read it. It's about a group of friends fending off evil during a siege, and it's got so much cool magic and exciting fights." They experience the story via plot. And that is why I urge writers to use plot questions when they're planning the structure of their novel. They help you look at your story through the lens of a reader. Now that you understand the why, what the heck is a plot question? Simply put, plot questions are questions that a reader asks, often unconsciously, about the plot, and they meet the following criteria. It starts with a will, concerns the story present and an outcome in the story future, and it is about the character's goals. Here are some examples. If you start reading Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, you will soon be asking, will Kelsier and his crew manage to overthrow the Lord Ruler? In Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, we're asking, will Gideon escape from the Ninth House? In Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail by Ashley Herring Blake, we're asking, will Astrid be successful with her redesign of the Everwood Inn? So, to break it down again, Astrid here is the character who is an interior designer. Her goal is to redesign the Everwood Inn, and the reader can easily wonder if she will be successful in the story's future. Pretty simple. But here's the thing. Once the reader asks this question, consciously or implicitly, they will relate all subsequent scenes in the book to the plot question. And if a scene is not contributing to answering the plot question, the reader will feel like the story slogs, even if they can't articulate why. You can test this with whatever novel you'd last read. If you felt the story had momentum, you will probably find that you knew instantly what the plot question was, and all the scenes worked on resolving it. If it didn't, chances are that you either didn't even know what the plot question was, or you felt the story went on a tangent and wasn't progressing it. All three examples that I listed here aren't exactly short books, but they all are pretty page-turnery because they are effectively structured around the plot question. So now that you know the power of this seemingly small technique, how exactly does it work? Key elements of successful plots. You might be wondering, wait, do you get just one plot question for the whole book? And the answer is that most books have 1 to 2 in total. I have never read a novel with more than 3, but that doesn't mean that they don't exist. Remember, this is not a formula, but a principle. In Mistborn, the question is, will Kelsier and his crew manage to overthrow the Lord Ruler? This is first established in the prologue, though its details solidify in later chapters. And then it's resolved at the end of the book, so for all intents and purposes, Mistborn has a single plot question. In Gideon the Ninth, will Gideon escape from the Ninth House? This plot question is established in the first line and resolved in chapter 5, by which point it is replaced by the question of will Harrowhark become a lictor, which is then resolved at the end of the book. So Gideon works off 2 plot questions. In Astrid Parker Doesn't Fail, will Astrid be successful with her redesign of the Everwood Inn? This question is established on page 3 and resolved around the 3/4 mark, when it is then replaced by the question of will Astrid and Jordan get back together? And that question is resolved then at the end of the book. So again, 2 plot questions for the whole book. The key points that I'd like you to take away here is that novels can be structured around more than one plot question, and that you can only raise a new plot question once the last one has been resolved. With that said, how do you manage to stretch a single question across hundreds of pages in a way that will still keep the reader engaged? The answer is that you break it into plot sub-questions. Now, don't confuse this with subplots. For the purposes of this video and this technique in general, we are not really distinguishing between main and subplots. That distinction simply doesn't matter a lot from a reader's perspective. Anyway, let's look at an example of plot sub-questions with the book In the Forests of Serre by Patricia A. McKillip. This is a fantasy/fairy tale story, and I'm gonna spoil some elements, so spoiler alert. The plot question is, will Prince Ronan and Princess Sidonie get married? And that one gets resolved at the end of the book. From chapter 1, they are already betrothed to each other, and so you might be wondering, why does it take a whole book to resolve? And that is where plot sub-questions come in. You see, Princess Sidonie first has to travel from a faraway land to Prince Ronan's land. So one plot sub-question is, will she arrive safely? Note that this is still very much related to the will they get married primary plot question, because progress on one automatically progresses the other. As for Prince Ronan, well, he runs afoul of a witch who curses him to be unable to find his way home until he pays a price for accidentally killing her favorite chicken. So when he steps out of his father's palace, he's completely lost in the woods. So the plot sub-question here is, will Prince Ronan find his way home in time for the wedding? That plot sub-question gets resolved around mid-book, I believe, but he manages to convince the witch to send him back by leaving his heart behind with her. So this prince goes back to the palace and meets his soon-to-be wife, but she's a bit weirded out by him. And then she learns that he's so weird because he no longer has a heart. And now she's like, nope, I'm not gonna marry a man without a heart. So she goes on a quest to find the witch to get his heart back. So then the plot sub-question here is, will she get his heart back? This should give you a good sense of how plot sub-questions work. Progress on the sub-question also progresses the primary question, and once you resolve one sub-question for one character, you can raise another one. You might also be wondering if you can have a sub-question, like let's say Prince Ronan loses his shoes while he's in the forest, and before he can find the witch, he has to find his shoes. I don't want to categorically say you can't do that, but I will say I've never seen it pulled off well. The farther away you get from the primary question, the more you risk the reader losing sight of the point of the plot. And remember, readers heavily rely on plot to orient themselves in a story. So as a rule of thumb, to keep your story structured in a way that works for readers, try to just stick with one layer of plot sub-questions. We already sort of covered this next key, and it is, when should your plot question be established by? All the books that I have mentioned so far establish their plot questions in the first chapter. Do you have to do that? No, again, this is not a formula. But, as discussed, plot is one big, if not the biggest element that the reader uses to orient themselves and measure progress and stay engaged. So just know that in the absence of a plot question, you really have to rely on other engagement mechanisms to keep the reader going. And if you're confident in your ability to pull those off, go for it. But as a rule of thumb, I would advise trying to fit the plot question into your first chapter. Now that we've established some key elements that make this tool successful, let's look at the do's and don'ts when you're using plot questions to structure your own novel. How do you actually present the plot question? You're not going to have an announcement saying, "Dear reader, you should focus on whether or not Samantha will bake a cake." Instead, you're going to cue the reader by presenting the plot question through conflict. As you now know, the plot question revolves around current character goals. And having obstacles in the way of those goals, so conflict, directs the reader's focus. It sharpens our attention because we inherently want to see if the character will achieve what they want despite the obstacle. There are, of course, lots of ways that you can go about this introduction, but I'll go over 3 categories that very often show up in books. Category 1 is conflict through direct dialogue. So here you draw attention to the plot question by having 2 characters have an active disagreement. Mistborn and In the Forest of Serre do this. In the prologue of Mistborn, we get this. "You're satisfied with this then?" Kelsier asked, nodding toward the hovel and its half-starved, overworked occupants. "You're content with a life full of beatings and endless drudgery?" "At least it's a life," Menace said. "I know what wages malcontent and rebellion bring. Men like you preach change, but I wonder, is this a battle we can really fight?" "You're fighting it already, Goodman Menace. You're just losing horribly." So Kelsier is trying to convince Menace and the other workers to rise up in rebellion against the Lord Ruler. But Menace is hesitant. The 2 characters have opposing goals and are expressing them in dialogue, and that opposition is conflict. The reader is immediately cued to, oh, will he eventually win them over? Will the rebellion succeed? And that is essentially the plot question of the book. In Forest of Serre, we have this exchange in the first chapter. "You will marry." His father's powerful voice had a deep feral resonance. It drove the words into Ronan like an axe into wood. "In 4 days." "I will not marry." The force of the shout tearing out of Ronan startled him. He did not recognize his own voice, but the king only matched it with a shout of his own. "How dare you?" Pretty clear conflict, so the reader is asking, oh man, will they marry? Which is indeed the plot question here. Category 2 shows conflict through direct action. So here authors dramatize their characters actively pursuing their goal and then failing to achieve it because of obstacles. Gideon the Ninth does this. Here is the opening sentence. In the myriadic year of our Lord, the 10,000th year of the King Undying, the kindly Prince of Death, Gideon Nav packed her sword, her shoes, and her dirty magazines, and she escaped from the house of the Ninth. Very goal-oriented behavior, except we soon learned that she didn't actually manage to escape all the way. She did try very hard, but the opening line of chapter 2 then is, "There were 5 minutes to go when Gideon's 87th escape plan got messed up fantastically." By now it's very clear to the reader what Gideon wants, and so we begin asking, will she escape from the Ninth House? Which is the opening plot question of the book. The key here is that the goal is clear to the reader, and also that the character doesn't achieve the goal too soon. Category 3 I would call internal stakes. This is admittedly the least exciting of the three, but it's still effective, and it gets often used in genres that don't have a lot of action and adventure, such as contemporary romance, for example. Here you simply are told through exposition what the character wants and what their hopes are, and also what's at stake for them. On page 3 of Astrid Parker, we get this. The Everwood Inn was famous, and being featured on Inside America could change everything for Astrid. This was her chance to go from small-town designer with a failed engagement to something more, something better, someone her mother actually liked. As you can see, there isn't much in the way of direct conflict here. Astrid actually already got the job, so it's not so much about getting the job, but rather about what it means to her. If you don't have prominent external opposition when you're introducing the plot question, the key is to have a clear establishing of the stakes, a clear possibility of failure, and a strong motivation. Like, here we don't know if she'll succeed at this gig, but we know that she really wants to, and understanding this still cues the reader into wanting to follow this as a plot question. So, make sure that you establish the plot question through conflict and/or stakes. And let me know in the comments whether the book that you're working on, or maybe the last one that you read, uses any of these three categories. The next do and don't that I would like to address is the concept of the one plot question at a time. That is a pretty firm principle if you want to make this structure work, but when you're working with a more sprawling story scope that has multiple point of view characters, it is possible to still keep the reader focused even if you have one plot question per point of view. But there's one big caveat to this. The different plot questions still need to add up to a coherent whole, both thematically and plot-wise in terms of the events. Like, in A Game of Thrones by George R. R. Martin, you have a lot of point of view characters, but all their goals ultimately revolve around who will rule Westeros and how they will get there. If you have multiple point of view characters with different plot questions, and those don't relate to one another, your story structure will be fundamentally weakened. If you've read In the Forests of Serre, you can actually see that happening in that book quite well. Yes, there is that clear will they marry plot question, but then there's also a couple of wizards in the book, and their plot questions revolve around this monster that has nothing to do with the princess and the prince getting married, and it just gets muddled. If you read the Goodreads reviews of it, you will see that reviewers are repeatedly saying that it felt like there was too much going on in the plot, or that the plot is, quote, all over the place. That is a direct consequence of having more than one plot question, even with multiple point of view characters. And to be clear, I'm not saying that this is a bad book. As a reader, I'd give it a solid 3 stars. It's actually a really good one to study if you want to see a mix of narrative elements that work and those that don't. So to reiterate, do stick with one plot question at a time in your story. And if you have multiple point of view characters with multiple plot questions, make sure all their plot questions are about one thing. And the third do and don't that I would like to discuss is do not confuse plot questions for any other story question. A well-written story will absolutely push the reader's curiosity buttons and get them to ask all sorts of questions, like, where is the cake? Who ate it? Why did Samantha insist on the pizza? When will you hit the like button? But none of these are plot questions as described in this video. The big difference between plot questions and any other question is that readers will tolerate not getting progress on any other question for a while. You can mention an odd detail like, there was a blue apple on the table, and the reader might ask, what's that about? But they will ultimately be fine if it's not mentioned, even for chapters on end. In fact, this is how you can seed mystery clues or build meaning over the course of a narrative. But if a story doesn't make progress on the plot question for a chapter, the reader will get antsy. No progress for 2 chapters, and your story might get into the did not finish territory. A whodunit mystery is a good example of what I'm talking about here. Usually these open with a murder, and the immediate question in the reader's head is who committed the murder, or maybe why. And that's a great mystery question. The plot question, however, ultimately becomes, will Detective so-and-so figure out who did it? And then we tend to be fine not knowing who did it for a whole book, but if the detective takes a break from investigating in order to be the guest judge at her nephew's baking competition, and it's not related to the plot question or plot sub-question, we are less fine. It feels like the story stalled. The bottom line is that the readers might measure interest and depth based on other story questions, but they measure story progress and momentum based off the plot question. So when you are planning your own novel, structure it via your plot question and plot sub-question. One more important part to keep in mind is that you move along the plot questions through character motivations and character choices, and I discuss those in depth in this video here. My name is Tina. I'm a writer, writing coach, and recovering academic. Until next time, write on.